Thank you. My talk is going to be an extended comment on Michele recent work, and I'll try to do a few things at once. Firstly, it would be aimed at drawing bridges between two different schools or movements inside social studies of science. That is sociology of science and science and technology studies. And I would argue that that is a proper time now for them to move closer to each other. That firstly, science and technology studies could and should learn sociology of science some lessons about such things as processes of consensus formation and the role of materiality, and vice versa, sociology of science provides insights into the nature of processes which are stand behind consensus formation inside science and technology studies themselves. And secondly, I will speculate on the relevance of Michele's works on the recent work on social studies of science to understanding better the Russian reality, and again vice versa, the relevance of this reality to development of sociology of science, our understanding of evaluated practices, and consensus formation on a more universal basis. This is a convenient scheme lots of us know quite well, partly because of Professor Collins' visit to St. Petersburg a year ago, partly from some other sources. This is a conventional interpretation of the development of sociology of knowledge. According to Professor Collins, it followed in three major waves. Wave one was represented by Robert Merton and his pupils. It mostly consisted of Robert Merton and a dozen of other people. I wouldn't say it would qualify for a paradigm, a dozen of people, but Professor Collins insists that it was a paradigm. And their major interest were comparative studies of academic organization, meaning they would try to interpret academic world as an institution or a community using the familiar methods of studying institutions and communities. Actually, Merton's sociology of science can be regarded as an extension of Parsonian theory of stratification. Parsons was obsessed with the task of explaining how legitimate domination is possible. How does it happen that some people go up and others down, and those who goes down accept this as a legitimate fact. And his papers on the nature of influence, for example, are very closely connected with Merton's treatment of Matthew effect, because here again we have an influence. We have influence as a social achievement, and influence which legitimates the possible inequality it produces. That is a characteristic trait of the first wave. According to Collins and lots of his colleagues, the second wave were absolutely different from the first one because it was not interested in academic organization. It was mostly interested in scientific knowledge as such. And a minor but related difference, and a very consequential one, was that while for the first wave humanities and the social sciences were a legitimate object of study, for the second wave only natural sciences were interesting because natural science produced a much more important knowledge, because they pretended they offer a superior kind of knowledge. And demystifying this kind of knowledge was a challenge and was a major interest for people like Harry Collins himself, or David Bloor, or Bruno Latour, or Steve Woolgar, and a lot of people whom we will meet in the next 2 days. Now, an input of ideas also occurred, but that was an input from inputs from microsociological theory, say ethnomethodology, critical theory, philosophy of language, and other sources which were totally alien to the first wave. According to Collins, currently the third wave is underway. The third wave is aimed at making finally the public impact the second wave prepared. That the aim of the third wave is to provide a public expertise, a meta expertise on the nature and limits of natural scientific knowledge. If there is a kind of consensus about the first two waves, the third is not a consensus at all, because we find some rival understandings of what is now going on. Interestingly, the first wave produced some kind of several examples of treatment of the development of natural history scientific schools, which fits the development of STS very well. Firstly, we have a group of enthusiasts which are producing very esoteric work. Secondly, and that was STS in the 70s. Secondly, they publish their work, their masterpieces in a book format are published, they create programs, and they begin major scholarly debates. That was the 80s. In the 90s, the debates inside social science themselves are mostly over, but great public debates began. This is the science wars, the events around the Sokol affair, and some other things which Professor Collins so colorfully remembers. On the other hand, the movement itself started to split. In the 90s, we have debates between David Bloor and Bruno Latour about the role of materiality and the way the STS should follow. In the years after 2000, we have debates between ethnomethodological wing and Collins and Evans, and what was previously a united movement, now a lot of conflicting groups. Nicholas Mullin's book on theories and theory groups in American sociology perfectly fits this picture. Still the idea of the third wave is perhaps the most widespread and most widely accepted description of what is going on now. At least it's most widely accepted in Russia, partly due to Professor Collins' charisma. The major idea behind the third wave is perhaps something which moves us back to the direction of the studies which were already conducted by the first wave. And that is, and it's implicit in the very claim that the third wave makes. According to the second wave scholars, their major task was to demystify the nature of the scientific knowledge, because scientists themselves were unreliable. As any kind of corporation, they tried to get as much as possible inside the area of their domination, to extend the sphere of their expertise as far as possible, and they were unreliable and sometimes untrustworthy in these attempts. The aim of the studies of science was to combat these imperialistic attempts on the part of the social sciences. Quite naturally, here emerges an inevitable reaction: who would stop the unreliable extension of the third wave itself? And who would study the kind of knowledge which the third wave produced, which would be symmetric for what they do with the natural sciences? Inevitably, we come to an idea of demystifying the social scientists' self-description, description of the natural sciences, which was surprisingly weak on the part of the STS scholars themselves. They were surprisingly not reflective on the ways they were studying laboratories. You will not find much reflection in Latour and Vulgar's book on what they were doing inside the laboratory and what was the methods of their study and how they produced the reality most science and technology students are currently share. Hopefully Professor Vulgar would reflect on that in the day after tomorrow. So certain weakness on the part of the science and technology studies, the lack of interest to humanities and social sciences is to be currently filled with new research. This weakness is even more surprising to account that the approach itself sometimes seems much better suited to studying social sciences and other non-natural sciences than sciences themselves. One of the major points of the science and technology studies approach was that scientists are mystifying their work when they invite others to judge them in terms of correctness. That is not correctness, that is legitimacy. Wide belief on what is proper and what is improper, some kind of cosmological beliefs, political interest, everything is an input to scientific discoveries, argued people like Donald Mackenzie and Latour and Bloor and many others whom all of us know. Definitely that is something which can be fit perfectly into our vision of the social sciences themselves. For definitely we have no kind of facts here. The idea of STS studies was that facts are flexible, they allow different interpretations, but here we have no facts at all and only interpretations, and it seemed that the whole philosophy or whole vision of the sciences could be put to studying social science with much better effect. Still there are important differences, and which make studies of the social sciences, including science and technology studies, a separate enterprise. The most important difference is that this vision of the nature of scientific work was incorporated by social sciences, but never incorporated by natural sciences. And according to Thomas' theorem, things which are defined as real has real consequences. For natural sciences, for most sciences, the character of their work as legitimating certain worldviews or invention rather than discovery was never legitimate. That is why, as Michele demonstrates, there are so important differences between what occurs on ecologist panels and social sciences panels. They are judging their work in different terms. Or in the case of natural sciences, they are trying to evaluate the correctness of some finding or possibilities of producing some findings as a result of funding of a proposal. The social sciences and humanists are discovering inventiveness, creativity, moral boldness, originality, and other qualities which are generally not present or not that salient in the case of the sciences themselves. Inevitably we ask here a question of how do these people who do not have an idea of reliable reality somewhere outside of the laboratory can agree on anything? How do we manage to agree, taking into account that 90% of sociologists believe that 90% of other sociologists are producing complete rubbish all the time? How do we manage to agree on giving some works or some proposals a credit of being original, qualitative, interesting? That of course returns to one of the major themes of the science and technology studies, the ambiguity of rules sciences pretend they follow. And here the ambiguity acquires new qualities. It can be better described in terms taken from institutional economics or economic sociology as advisor-reaper problem, for example, which is a class of a much bigger principal-agent problems. In the case of principal-agent problems, we treat a situation when a principal hires agent to do some work for him or herself, but he or she either cannot follow the movements of the agent or is unable to, or it's just too costly to do so. He or she tried to cut down the costs, but that leaves some discretion on the part of agent. And the agent can use this discretion to produce less valuable result or no result at all. This is generally the situation of the society or a state or public and the scientists. The scientists are doing some esoteric things which the public does not understand. The public has to trust scientists, but it doesn't know if that the scientists are producing some true discoveries or they're just taking money from the state and do nothing. Sometimes the state understands that it was not that right, or the public understands that it was not that right in these suspicions. Here we need an advisor. Somebody who would understand what scientists are doing, but at the same time would be reliable and would tell the truth to the public. And the problem is, of course, that the only person who would serve as an advisor are scientists, and scientists cannot be related on because they are interconnected, because they share common interests. There is a problem similar to the problem of a person buying a car from a car dealer, when the only person who knows the true quality of the car is the car dealer. So you can ask the car dealer if this car is good and worth your money, but the car dealer is having the best knowledge, has the least interest in telling you the truth. And the same goes for scientists. You have to ask scientists what other scientists are doing, but you do not know or cannot know in advance if they are going to tell you the truth. You have to invent some institutional design which would prevent them from giving you false information. The risk here is a risk of collusion when this kind of agent, one of them is observing another being observed, entering into agreement with each other and producing false information. In Russia is especially rich in this kind of designs. Those English and American and other publics following closely debates between Abramovich and Berezovsky has already taken from them some new Russian words. Previously that was Sputnik and Perestroika. Currently this is Откат. Откат is not very easily translatable into English. I had much trouble with explaining what is Откат, but Откat is exactly the kind of collusion when those who is to evaluate your work gives you a benefit of doubt, or even very large benefit of doubt, and shares your profits from doing your work not properly. STS, by the way, is an initiative or a movement which is trying to propose itself as alternative second-order agent, and second-order agent which would observe the scientists and tell society the truth finally. Any kind of jury or any kind of panel is exactly this kind of situation in a nutshell. Here we find academics. The academics are to share their ideas of what is a good work and what is bad work, and they usually have some personal stakes in the result of this deliberation. They can promote the interest of their network, their institution, their theory group, and they can use their inevitably ambiguous rules defining what is excellence to extract these benefits. In trying to prevent their colleagues in such doings or misdoings, the academics elaborate a code of behavior which Michele describes, but this code is defined in even more ambiguous terms. What is disciplinary sovereignty, for example? Surprisingly, as she reports, we observe only minor transgressions. She states that the best ways to set the rules is to look for cases when they are transgressed as this ever, but what she describes are only minor transgressions. And the question we cannot but ask is, why are generally only minor ones? What are the bases of which make politicians or economic agents being much less reliable and virtuous than academic agents? The question becomes especially astonishing when we find out that in other national academic systems their dominant behavior pattern is not that virtuous at all. And here comes the Russian case. Yeah. I'll explain what is it in a few minutes. There is a common agreement in Russia when an awful degree devaluation occurs. Russian president, past and present, Mr. Putin, and Russian president in past and future, like Arthur, and Russian president and present, Mr. Medvedev, addressed the problem at the television, saying that degree devaluation is a national disgrace and a major threat to our innovation development. Lots of minor officials said basically the same thing. There is a common feeling that any kind of marks of quality Russian academics give to each other signal little in terms of abilities, reputation, or anything. Until very recently, you could see people on the way at Nevsky station proposing you to buy from them a dissertation. Now you do not see these people, but the internet is full of spam promising you a degree in very short terms. It's widely accepted that major governmental grants are received by those who have connection in the granting panels, or that most journals which boast having a peer review committee use them only as a decoration, because all the important decisions are made by the editor, him or herself, but not by the peer reviewers. The Russian government and other sectors, or even the same sectors of the academic public, were not passive in this situation. They tried to invent a kind of a monitoring institutional design which would guarantee reliability of various second-order agents. And in doing this, they followed generally one of the same logic. They were firstly trying to invite as much new second-order agent as possible, preferably second-order agent coming from institution which would be as far as possible from the institution where the evaluation actually occurs. The idea behind that, the culture of suspicion, was based on the notion that there is a kind of a parochial academic networks, but the weakness of networks is that they are mostly localized in some geographical settings. So if we take experts from other settings, they would be reliable. And secondly, the second idea behind that was that visibility and especially retrievable material traces of the deliberation would be reliable in the sense of being open to reinterpretation, re-evaluation by some new second-order agents, and they would commit those who leave these traces to behaving virtuously. This is a map of a dissertation process. I see the expression of vivid pain on some of the faces. The figures marked yellow are different agents, second-order agents, which are involved in the evaluation. The PhD process starts with admission committees who admit you to aspirantura or graduate studies, and then you have to secure a publication in one of the journals from the VAC list, where a peer review is to be conducted, and then there are different divisions which will approve your dissertation, different review hearings, and finally there would follow a defense for which you have to bring reviews from an external organization, ведущая организация, the leading organization, and from some independent reviewers, and then you send all the documents to WAC, which is All Russian Attestation Committee, and then WAC there are new experts, and if they dislike a dissertation, they send it to another dissertation council, and finally you get the degree, which usually takes a year from the moment you already have the text, all the text written. This is probably the most extensive and, in a way, even elegant monitoring architecture ever invented by any academic world. We do not know if that would work. It seems that, even in spite of this extensiveness, it was very weak at certain points. Say, the requirement to publish something in a peer-reviewed journal led to establishment of lots of journals at nearly any institution when there is a dissertation council. And these journals were totally controlled by the same people who control the department or a faculty. Now the market for dissertation services offers you not only dissertation as such, but also some papers to be sent to journals if you do not have connection in the right journal yourself. The Russian government was not, of course, passive here, and it tried to retaliate, and there were lots of counter moves, like the idea most entertained now is that also there are parochial and corrupted networks inside the country. They do not reach outside the country. So the foreign experts are always reliable. A publication in foreign peer-reviewed journals are uncorruptible. As most of us can find out looking into our mailboxes, this is a very optimistic view of the situation. Typically, mailboxes of University Public in Russia are full of spam, offering them a publication in a foreign peer-reviewed journal, sometimes even indexed by the Web of Science, but it seems that mostly this is fake proposals. And sometimes we receive invitation from Lambert academic publishers who invite us to publish our monographs in Germany in an international publisher. And this is definitely not a kind of a specifically Russian problem. It seems that most third world countries are affected by the same kind of epidemic. Say, if you go to the International Sociological Association website, you can find there an announcement warning those who participated in the last Congress in Gothenburg in Sweden the last summer from sending their papers and $300 to representative of fake journal Sociology Study from Knowledge to Wisdom, which express its willingness to publish the conference papers. What I like most is the proposals to participate in an international conference in resort in Bulgaria or Austria or Italy. That's such a big temptation. Of course, the Russian government is not that passive again, and it tries to invent new and new measures. The last one we ran into when prepared a proposal for a major Russian grant in which Professor Andy Pickering was to participate. Professor Pickering was to show his cumulative impact factor to qualify for this grant. And he turned out to be unaware what it is. And nobody was aware, and Google knew nothing, because this is not a kind of an established scientometric measure. From what was offered in other instructive papers, it seemed that cumulative impact factor is a way to add impact factors of all journals in which you published your papers in the last 10 years. And that was treated as the most reliable sign of academic merit. Why? Simply because you can imagine a parochial network, the leader of which would make all of its members to quote his or her works. But the idea is that also this parochial network could emerge even in international science. It would not find its way to leading international journals. And though journals with big impact factor are more reliable than all others. And secondly, even this kind of citation would belong to one person, but impact factor is based on aggregated citation of all papers in these journals. In this sense, no kind of vicious academic network would be able to enhance this kind of result for its leader. We do not know if that thing would work. Maybe it would, because the experiment in monetary engineering has just started. But what we know is that really workable systems are not that complicated. They have nothing to do with the bureaucratic monster on the previous slide. They are much simpler. And the question is, why do they work? That was the major question of a research project we started the last year. and which try to compare the status symbolism in 5 different academic worlds. We were focusing on sociologists and 5 sociologists, French, United States, British, German and Russian ones. And we were mostly focusing on the symbols which were closest to the labor market as such, because of the belief they would be most under hardest pressure as a result. This is some of the details of the research. We have some 50 interviews so far, lots of statistical data on labor markets and information on history in which institutions disseminated symbols of academic status were working in the last 50 years. It seems that what we find in different countries are mostly following very similar logic. In all countries we have some varieties on the common theme of division of expert labor. There is distributive power which belongs to those who invite you to occupy a position, and there is symbolic or significative power which belongs to those who give you a mark of quality, and they should not be the same people. So that status markets emerge, people belonging to a certain academic class are believed to be suitable for certain academic jobs, but those who determine you belong to the status group and those who actually invite you to take a position are different people. That seems more or less universal dictum. But there were lots of different minor accents in that. We have seen, for example, that in the Russian case, that was an attempt to find evaluating experts as far from the prospective working place as possible, but there were no attempts to pass any kind of inbreeding laws which would banish being hired at the same department which issued your degree, and which are quite widespread outside of Russia. What was the origins of the difference? Why this kind of difference in institutional structures emerged, and which of them could be ultimately responsible for differences in more or less virtuous or vicious academic behavior? The following slide is the list of the major mechanisms involved in securing virtuous behavior by academics. In most academies we find attempts to change motivation of the first order agent to create a demand for reliable and universally recognized marks of quality. This is the solution which originates from economic sociological literature and from Klein's book on reputation, for example, from literature on information economics, which claims that the most reliable source of information is the source which lives from its information being reliable. So if you can establish an agency which is paid exactly for the fact that it provides reliable information, it tries to be as reliable as possible. It is working in many spheres of economics, but it doesn't seem to be working anywhere in the academic world as such. Another theme is changing motivation of second order agent and trying to put them as far as possible from their possible corrupter is a theme we have already treated. Thirdly, there is an attempt to narrow the discretion of certain order agents, and that is exactly what the Russian government is currently mostly experimenting. Fourthly, there is attempts or occurrences of new observation channels being established, so that new second order agents who join the game and new third order agent who would observe the second order agent would also participate. Fourthly, there is a need to provide second and third order agent with retaliation opportunities. And finally, sixthly, there must be some kind of institutional incentive for them to penalize or punish those who deviate from common norms. What is interesting about this list and what moves us closer to the next few days of the conference, all of these changes and achievements and all of these fairs are infrastructural by their nature. Observation channels are infrastructural. Observation mobility channels, which would cause the motivation or incentive scheme for first-order agents, are infrastructural. And infrastructural development creates new channels and invites new second-order agents to participate in evaluation. The easiest example is sites like Rate My Teacher, who now include students into the number of those who could evaluate a given professor. Previously, the only way a potential employer could find out if a new professor is able to teach is to observe his performances or her performances during conferences. But this is a very unreliable thing, because some people who are brilliant conference presenters are very dull teachers simply because they are not enthusiastic. The way of forming this reputation was only quite unreliable one. Now we have students, reviews, and they are probably much more in a much better position to evaluate the performance. The problem, of course, is that here is a prototypical case for forming a potential collusion. The professor does not require too much from the pupils, and the pupils does not evaluate the professor too lowly, and they part finally very happy with each other, but with students getting very little from all their education. Sometimes this inclusion of new second-order agents seem to provoke very vicious kind of behavior. In a recent scandal, when an important Russian historians were making anonymous comments on the book of his competitors at Amazon.com, saying that they were producing very low quality and boring research, presumably in an attempt to lower the rates in which their books were sold. Even more important, the infrastructural development in the case of influence on not visibility but mobility. Mobility is the key factor which causes what would be the motivation of first-order agents. And one thing which opposes Russia to most other cases we described or attempted to describe was that in Russia we find very low mobility rates. There are a huge number of universities in Russia. The last count I remember was like 1,200, which is less than in the United States, but not much less. And there are 110 sociology department, which is very similar to what is currently present in the United States. But the major difference is that at least 75 of these 110 departments are the only such department in town, and the chances for an academic in most disciplines, especially social sciences, to continue his or her career outside of the city when it began is very low. So basically you can expect all of your academic life to be spent in one of the same department. And in this case, and this situation generally very much influences the way you behave. The only constant direction of mobility we could observe is the mobility from provincial cities to the capital, Moscow, to a much lesser degree to St. Petersburg, and sometimes, but very rarely, an opposite mobility from the capital cities to the city of origin. There are very low mobility between different regional centers, except Moscow and St. Petersburg. Why it matters? It matters simply because in the market with high mobility you need a translatable reputation. You need some way to inform the potential employer about yourself. You need some kind of attributes which would be a competitive advantage. Attributes in terms of competences, theoretical allegiances, areas of research you represent. Something which would make you marketable. In the case when the successors are handpicked, this is not a need, this is not a must. You do not really need to get you known, you do not need to have any attributes which would oppose you to other candidates and make superior to them in any way. This is a very different kind of competition. The competition at the labor market is there, but this is a network, not a categorical competition. And the attributes which might make you more successful in the market have nothing to do with originality or giving influential papers. As a matter of fact, sometimes originality is a competitive disadvantage rather than advantage. In this profoundly market logic, the best candidate, network market logic, the best candidate is the candidate which is wholly dependent on you, who would never go to somebody else, to some new patron. And this is the most mediocre candidate, of course, because otherwise he or she can leave you and go to another time, which is widely regarded as treacherous behavior. And now we'll return for a few steps back. Another thing about all these visibility things is that, surprisingly, the kind of jury or the kind of second and third order agent which are most effective, which Michele describes, are the agents which are connected by the most ancient, even primitive in a way, observation channels. These are the people who are co-present, who are present in the same space. No journals, which are infrastructural achievements, no internet, nothing of that kind. People are gathering in one room and they're debating something and they observe each other and they're exchanging the roles of second and third order agent constantly. They see how others judge and they understand that others are judging them at the moment. And this is a system which is firstly completely untransparent for the outsiders, but it is much more transparent to the insiders. From what Michele tells us, it follows that this richness of information channels are much better in promoting virtuous behavior than a much more complicated system of institutionalized observation. Why is it so? One reason is that this is simply they simply have more information about each other. They are participating in what Goffman called the interaction order, and Goffman's definition of interaction order is the order in which the information exchange is richest, because there are lots of things, lots of information people exude. The further distance between observer and those one who is observed is that the higher the potential for the observed to manipulate the information. The less information is involuntarily exuded and the more information is voluntarily communicated. If you're exchanging your opinion in emails, you can invent a good reason why you support this proposal or this candidate. Where you're presenting in face-to-face discussion, you have much less time and most people have much more difference because of cognitive complexity of the task to invent a good cover for their potentially vicious motives. And so for members of the jury, there is much more transparency about each other's motives. But there is much less transparency for any outside agent to monitor them. Why at the moment they behave virtuously? An argument here, and one of the arguments here, I believe, come from the area of political sociology. Michele very helpfully compares that to working on deliberate democracy. And we have an old question of when democracy works, asked by Dahl and Putnam and many others. And it seemed that the common reason was that democracy is workable when it relies on civil society structures and civil society solidarities as strong solidarity groups to which all of us belong and to which credible promises could be made, and by which credible promises could be made. The members of Anglo-American juries, it seems from Michele's description, are present there as representatives of different schools or theory groups or disciplines or sub-disciplines with their own standards and their own ideas of what is good and not good work. They have to negotiate in a certain way. They are quite often in a situation of a zero-sum game or something which approaches the situation. So they have to negotiate some results between them. In this situation, they have a choice. They cannot win much by behaving opportunistically, because if one starts to behave opportunistically, all the rest start the same game, and the final result one of them gives is what game theory says they will get, and they would get the same result, probably very similar to the one they would get if they're behaving virtuously. But in the first case, they have this result and moral satisfaction. And the second case, they have the same result without moral satisfaction. That seems a very good case for moral satisfaction. So it may be, this is a hypothesis. This is one of the ideas which emerged from our research, and the reason I'm describing is exactly that it seems to bring closer the ideas on infrastructure and materiality and what is going on with academic peers. It may be that the structure of the labor market, which are in the last hand are infrastructurally determined, give us the nature of academic groupings prevailing in certain national academic world. And the presence of these groupings determine what will go on in the juries and how the juries will be organized. The juries themselves are definitely also an infrastructural achievement. They're the simplest way of communication, but they're not the cheapest in terms of money or human capital. And they are not equally available to academics from all countries. It may be that combination of infrastructural possibilities producing necessary kind of academic groupings and giving opportunities for their negotiation in a necessary setting do promote virtuous behavior. I'm not sure that this is the only kind of explanation available. As you have noticed, this is a kind of a purely structural explanation. The first reaction after description of the Russian case might be in cultural, not in structural terms. Banfield books on immoral families is something which is very popular in Russia exactly because it seems to cover the dynamics of Russian academic, political, and economic life quite well. But a good thing with a good policy with structural explanation is to follow them as far as possible and try to explain as much with them as we could, leaving the rest to being explained by other measures or other approaches. What I would like to say in conclusion is that the program of the STS workshop we observe, in the way we observe it, emerged by a pure chance. There were two different groups in working towards welcoming Michele here and welcoming the STS scholars who will see tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. These groups were working absolutely autonomously. It was only some month ago when we find out that we're working in this direction. And it was only some month ago which we asked ourselves if that would be a good idea to put all the presenters together. And the more we thought about this idea, the more we liked it, because it seemed that now merging of science and technology studies and sociology of science is the most likely and is likely to be most profitable for all who would take part in them. Thank you.
Michael, I think we'll put the burden and the order of comments and the comments. A third order comment on Michele.
Okay, well, I really found the presentation super interesting, and I'm very eager to learn more about the findings from your case study, the five country comparison. It's very, very tantalizing, and I hope that the findings will be available in English as well, so we might learn about them. The conclusion kind of leads us to think about what are the conditions that might favor more geographic mobility. And I think this is exactly where I would have gone as well. I'm thinking about, now I'm going to contradict myself and draw on the British case as a model. It seems to me that one of the things that the British reform and evaluation did is really to pit departments against each other, in which has stimulated the prevalence of market mechanisms. So basically, if departments depend on their capacity to attract stars or to nurture internal stars in order to get resources to develop, then those could be described as forces that would limit the impact of localistic as opposed to cosmopolitan orientation. Here I'm referring to one of Merton's classical paper where he compared the local and the cosmopolitan in academia, with both groups having different types of networks and valuing different kinds of rewards. It seems to me that we need to think systematically about putting in place, you know, here of course I'm talking about the Russian system without knowing anything about it besides what I just learned. So please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But if I'm thinking from a strict logic of market, you know, to pit departments against each other so that they would be in competition for attracting the people who are most productive, as opposed to those who are the safest and the most mediocre and least likely to challenge the local leaders, would be maybe a possible approach, albeit a cruel approach. But if I think about the cruel market mechanisms that are in vigor in some of the, you know, partly public universities in the US, it's very simple. If your department is not able to attract resources, it has to teach, each faculty member has to teach larger classes with fewer teaching assistants, which means that the work conditions really worsen quite quickly, so that departments are very much told it's in your interest to bring in grants from the National Science Foundation, etc. So the analysis reminded me also of a paper that Paul DiMaggio wrote about how in the US we moved from having a local bourgeoisie to having a national bourgeoisie, with two very different kinds of sets of institutions that were associated with it. So for instance, in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts and the Symphonic Orchestra were created, this is his analysis, by the local bourgeoisie as sites in which they could perform status display to improve their own, you know, each you know, philanthropist to improve their own position in the local picking order. When the national bourgeoisie, when these various local bourgeoisies that were in Boston and Cincinnati and New York started unifying themselves with the transformation of the American economy, you had a new sets of dynamics that kicked in terms of which currencies could be used within these local bourgeoisies to improve their own standing. So to me, it would be kind of interesting to think in parallel here about the creation of national economies as a way to counter the localistic processes that were described. For instance, tenure is a terrible thing, but it's also a great thing. Basically, after 6 years, the way it works for those of you who don't know, your department sends letters to 10, 15 experts in other parts of the country. As a candidate, you don't know who will be written. You can provide names, but typically the list of names are half from you and half generated by your department, and they have to be approved by the deans. And those people are asked to read your file, which is, you know, basically maybe a book, 2 books, and a whole bunch of of publication, and the letters that each of these 12 people write is typically, you know, from 3 to 5 pages, so they're very detailed. They take several days to produce. It's a very, very demanding thing, but this means that no department is able to stop a tenure. There are people who come up for tenure who are not appreciated locally, but because all those letters are positive, the department is forced to give them tenure, and vice versa. There are local people who have who are adored locally, but if the national letters are not demonstrating that this person is strong, the person cannot get tenure. And then, if they don't get tenure, they're forced to go out and try to find a job elsewhere. So this is a mechanism that enforces mobility. So one of the puzzles I have with the Russian case is, you know, is it that it's a culture of low spatial mobility for all professions, that simply in the US people normally leave the town where they grew up to go to college, especially if they are middle class. So they've already uprooted themselves from their local community when they're 18. And then this culture of geographic mobility is very much part of what defines the American middle class. And then, you know, they go to see their family at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. And so it's a way of living that I just don't understand whether it is simply not present in Russia, and whether in fact the localistic trends that we find in academia are part of a much bigger problem. The other thing that puzzled me is this thing about buying degrees. I don't know why Putin would have wanted a PhD. Is it like, and why would he want a fake PhD? You know, is it that within the political class, having such degrees is absolutely crucial? There's other, in the US, you have schools of public affairs like the Kennedy School or the Woodrow Wilson School that gives Masters of Public Affairs, which, you know, for which you don't need to write a dissertation, but which many politicians do have, and they become, you know, credentials that certainly contribute to their political success. So that is a question, I guess, that would speak to the meaning of degrees and the intersection or the overlap between the political and the academic field. The question of the scandals, I mean, it seems that in a system like this one, shaming is extremely difficult because there's a lot of shameful things that are happening. So therefore, an alternative would be to use, you know, to implement rules that would prevent interference, and I don't fully understand why this is not being done. While I was in France, there was a huge scandal with the committee that is in charge of giving all promotions. It's a committee made of 6 people, and half of them are appointed by politicians, and on this committee you have some of the most mediocre French sociologists, because they're appointed by the politicians, and then you have some very good sociologists who are asked to serve or refuse to serve because the committee is full of mediocre people. But last year, half of that committee gave to themselves the promotion to exceptional class. So this was an enormous scandal, and you had, you know, denunciation of it in the journals and the newspapers. One of the problem is that there's a commission in France, an organization in France called the AERS, which is the agency that is supposed to credentialize all universities. It's their role to police. And because of my book, I was brought into a conversation with the head of this organization, and basically they are not fully aware of the problem. They don't understand that if they were to put in place rules that simply prevents people on these commissions from giving themselves those promotions, that would already, you know, through a very simple administrative mechanism, take care of half of the problem. But it's also that the people who chair such organizations, this guy in particular I was talking to is a chemist, so, and he's a physician. You know, he has no idea how things are happening at the university. The position is in part, you know, a honorific position. So I'm thinking, you know, in the Russian case, I'm sure that you all have given a lot of thoughts to. I'm not sure that the solution is to create an organigram even more complex than what you already have, but there must be ways of, you know, creating standards of behavior that are punishable, you know, and that can be reinforced. So I don't know. These are just a few thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michele. Well, Michele very frequently stresses that she's Quebecois, I guess Quebecoise, right?
Yes.
That should be the rule in French, okay. And in a sense, of course, the comparative cultural sociology or the comparative sociology of relation was forced upon Michele by her fact of being Quebecoise and going to France and then to America and always reflecting upon that. What I wanted to thank Michele for today is that she came and she forced upon us an experience by her very presence that we could look at ourselves in the mirror of France and the United States and Canada, and also in the mirror of your sociology of culture. So, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.